Federal Hill, Providence, Rhode Island. A narrow street called Etwell's Avenue, lined with brick storefronts. The kind of place where the smell of espresso drifts out of doorways even after midnight. It is the early 1960s, though no calendar hangs anywhere in this story. No clock ticks loudly enough to be heard. There is only the low hum of a refrigerator case full of cigarettes, the soft clack of a pinball machine being nudged into silence, and a single man standing in the doorway of a plain, two-story wood-frame building drawing on a cigar, watching the street the way a lighthouse keeper watches the sea, inside that building. Behind a wall thinner than anyone inside it would ever have guessed. A small microphone, no larger than a shirt button, is doing something extraordinary. It is listening. It has been listening for months. And on the other end of a cable that runs out through brick and plaster and into the cold New England night, two federal agents sit in a parked car with headphones pressed to their ears, transcribing word for word the private business of the most powerful man in New England's underworld. He does not know it yet, for now. He only knows that business is good, that the office is quiet, and that no one on this street would ever dare to cross him. He is wrong. And the story of exactly how wrong he is. How a man who once seemed untouchable would be undone, not by a rival's bullet, but by a hidden wire. A turncoat's testimony, and the cold mathematics of federal law, is the story we are about to tell. It begins decades before that cigar smoke ever curled into the Providence sky, and it ends in a present far quieter, far smaller, and far sadder than anyone standing on Etwell's Avenue that night could have imagined. This is the story of the Patriarca crime family. Settle in, we have a long road ahead of us, and there is no need to rush. Before we step into the fog of Federal Hill, if you don't mind, leave a comment below and let me know what time it is right now wherever you are, and which corner of the world you're listening from. It's a small thing, but it's nice to know who's out there in the dark with me. And if you find that this kind of long, quiet history helps you unwind, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this channel keep telling these stories. And it costs you nothing but a tap. Now, get settled. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. The full story is just ahead. Before there was a Patriarca family, before that name meant anything to anyone outside a small circle of Italian immigrant neighborhoods in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, there were two separate smaller organizations, feeling their way through the dark of a new American century. Imagine for a moment Boston's North End around 1910. Narrow streets stacked with three-story brick tenements, laundry strung between windows, pushcarts loaded with fish and produce rattling over cobblestones. Sicilian and southern Italian immigrants had been arriving for 2 decades by then, carrying with them not just language and food and faith, but also older systems of loyalty and obligation that had survived the ocean crossing intact. Mutual aid societies, neighborhood patrons, and, quietly, the seeds of organized criminal structure transplanted from villages in Sicily and Calabria. According to the historical record pieced together by historians and crime researchers over the decades, the man generally credited as the first boss of what would become the Boston faction was Gaspare Nicola, who led the organization from around 1910 until he was murdered. On September 21, 1916, almost nothing about Nicola survives in detail. No photographs that historians widely circulate. No courtroom transcripts, nothing but a name and 2 dates a few years apart. He is, in a sense, a ghost at the very beginning of this story, present just long enough to mark a starting point, and then gone after Nicola's death. Gaspare Messina took over and led the Boston organization from 1916 until he stepped down in 1924. He died in 1957. Messina's tenure overlapped with a much larger and more dramatic conflict happening 200 miles to the south. In New York City, what historians call the Castellamarese War, The brutal struggle among New York's Italian-American underworld factions that would eventually give rise to the modern five-family structure. Messina's position in Boston connected him to that wider world. During the Castellamarese War, other mafia bosses appointed Messina temporarily as a kind of overarching boss of bosses for a couple of years, a sign that even from New England, the Boston faction's leadership carried weight on a national stage. Working alongside Messina was a man named Joseph Lombardo, sometimes called J.L., who served as his underboss. Lombardo organized several Sicilian criminal gangs in Boston, and among his most significant achievements was helping eliminate the powerful Irish-American Guston gang, which had controlled bootlegging and rackets in the South Boston waterfront. It was an early, telling pattern, the gradual displacement of Irish criminal power in Boston by the rising Italian organizations, a shift that would echo for decades. Meanwhile, in Providence, Rhode Island, a separate but related organization was forming under a man named Frank Morelli, sometimes called Butsy. Morelli led the Providence faction from 1917 until 1932, when he stepped down and became underboss to a man named Philip Bucola. Morelli's Providence operation and Messina's Boston operation functioned in these early years as cooperating but distinct subgroups, two cities, two crews, loosely bound by the same broad network of obligation and respect that connected Italian-American criminal organizations up and down the East Coast. This was the era of Prohibition, and it is impossible to overstate how much that single piece of federal legislation reshaped organized crime in America. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol nationwide, and in doing so, handed an entire industry overnight to whoever was willing to break the law to supply it. In Boston and Providence alike, that meant bootlegging operations, smuggling routes along the Atlantic coast, hijacked liquor shipments, and a flood of cash that hardened small neighborhood rackets into serious criminal enterprises. The young men who would later become the captains and bosses of the Patriarca family. Men with names like Raymond Patriarca. Men still in their teens and 20s during these years came of age precisely inside this bootlegging economy, learning its lessons of violence, discretion, and political protection. By 1924, leadership of the Boston faction passed to Filippo Phil Bucola, a Sicilian-born mobster who had arrived in Boston some years earlier. Bucola led the Boston organization from 1924, and in 1932 he united both the Boston and Providence factions into a single family. He eventually retired and died in 1987, according to crime historian accounts of this period. As Messina and Lombardo aged, Bucola, who had arrived in Boston from Palermo, Sicily, rose alongside them, and Lombardo would never climb higher than underboss. While Bucola became the recognized boss of Boston at the time, the relationship between the two cities had a kind of hierarchy to it. The Boston family functioned almost like the senior partner over Providence and the rest of New England, comparable in scale to how Chicago related to a smaller satellite city like Kansas City within the broader national underworld. There is also a darker, quieter footnote from this period worth pausing on. After the murder of Jewish mob boss Charles King Solomon, reportedly carried out at Bucola's command, Bucola became the most powerful gangster in Boston. Solomon had controlled a significant share of Boston's bootlegging and gambling, rackets independent of the Italian organizations. His removal cleared the field. It is worth being honest about how thin some of the documentation from this era is. Much of what we know about the 1920s and early 1930s comes from later testimony, congressional hearings, and the recollections of men who were sometimes unreliable narrators of their own pasts. Where the record is genuinely uncertain, we will say so as we go. But the broad shape of the story, two cooperating Italian-American criminal factions in Boston and Providence, hardened by Prohibition, gradually merging into one organization under Bucola's leadership in 1932, is well supported across multiple historical accounts. By the early 1930s, then, there was a single organization, headquartered nominally in Boston, with a loyal and increasingly ambitious branch operating in Providence. Frank Morelli, the old Providence boss, had stepped back into the underboss role. Morelli would serve as that faction's caporegime and underboss figure through the 1930s and into the 1940s, eventually retiring in 1947 and waiting in the wings, working his way up through the Providence rackets with a patience that would come to define his entire career, was a young man named Raymond Patriarca. Before we follow him any further, though, it's worth pausing on something that the soft hum of this story's opening chapter has perhaps obscured. How ordinary, how almost domestic, the beginnings of all of this really were. Pushcarts, tenement kitchens, a bar on a street corner where a child watched men argue in low voices over the price of bootlegged whiskey. This was not yet an empire. It was a scattering of neighborhood rackets, run by men who, in another life, in another country, might have spent their whole lives as fishermen, tailors, or shopkeepers. What turned them into something larger, into the structure that would eventually carry the Patriarca name across 6 decades and 5 states, is the story we turn to now. But peace among the rising men of Federal Hill never lasted long, and the quiet years of the 1930s were already, without anyone quite realizing it, building toward the rise of one man who would reshape the entire organization in his own image. What does it take to build a criminal empire that lasts 30 years? According to the men who studied him most closely, police detectives, FBI agents, and eventually congressional investigators, the answer, in Raymond Patriarca's case, was patience, discipline, and an almost total absence of unnecessary risk. He was not the flashiest gangster New England ever produced. He was, by most accounts, something far more dangerous, a quiet, methodical operator who understood that the appearance of legitimate business and the reality of criminal control could be made to look identical. If you were careful enough, Raymond Patriarca was born on March 17, 1908, in Worcester, Massachusetts, to Eleuterio Patriarca, an Italian immigrant from the village of Archi in the Lazio region, and Vincenza, sometimes called Mary Jane de Numala, an Italian-American woman. At the age of 4, the family moved south to Providence, Rhode Island, settling in the Federal Hill neighborhood that would remain his home and his base of power for the rest of his life. It was, and still is, the city's little Italy, narrow streets, Italian grocers, social clubs, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce drifting from open kitchen windows even in winter. Patriarca's childhood was hard in the unremarkable way that so many immigrant childhoods of that era were hard. He left school at the age of 8 to work, shining shoes and serving as a bellhop. According to research into his background, his father ran a bar and liquor store, and it was there, as a boy moving among the bar's clientele, that young Raymond got his first real exposure to the criminals and hustlers of the neighborhood. When Raymond was 17, his father died, leaving behind a widow and 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. By then, all the Patriarca children were old enough to work, and like so many immigrant families of the period, they crowded together into the same house on Federal Hill, pooling whatever income they could find. Patriarca would later tell a congressional committee, with characteristic understatement, that he had drifted a little after his father's death. That drift, as it turned out, drifted directly into a life of crime. As a teenager, Patriarca was charged with hijacking, armed robbery, assault, safe-cracking, and auto theft. By the time Prohibition ended in 1933, he had already been indicted as an accessory to murder. His record by his early 20s spanned bootlegging, robbery, and according to court documentation, a 1931 conviction at age 23 for violating the White Slave Traffic Act, commonly known as the Mann Act related to prostitution, for which he received a year and a day in federal prison. It is worth being direct about this part of his record, rather than glossing over it. Before he became known as a careful, businesslike crime boss, Raymond Patriarca had already built a long rap sheet that ranged from petty theft to violent crime, and his early adulthood included involvement in the prostitution trade. There is a particular episode from 1938 that historians return to again and again, because it tells you almost everything you need to know about how Patriarca operated, even decades before he became a boss. That year in Providence, he and an accomplice named Benjamin Tilley were caught holding stolen jewelry. A judge sentenced Patriarca to up to 5 years in Massachusetts State Prison on robbery, assault, and burglary charges. The Providence Board of Public Safety, around this same period, had already named him Public Enemy Number 1, but Patriarca served only about 4 or 5 months of that sentence before being paroled. What happened in between is a small masterclass in how organized crime in mid-century America actually functioned, not through brute force alone, but through the quiet purchase of political access. An inquiry later revealed that Executive Counselor Daniel H. Coakley, a close associate of Massachusetts Governor Charles F. Hurley, had drawn up a parole petition for Patriarca based on the appeals of a supposed Father Fagan, a priest who, as it turned out, did not exist. Coakley had simply invented him. According to the FBI's own later memos on the matter, an illicit payment of approximately $38,000, an enormous sum for 1938, had been delivered to Coakley to arrange Patriarca's release. When the scheme came to light, Coakley was impeached and dismissed from the governor's office. In 1940, for Patriarca, the scandal was, in a strange way, a victory. It did not damage his reputation in the underworld. It enhanced it. Word spread that this young Providence operator had political connections strong enough to buy his way out of state prison. In a business built on reputation as much as muscle, that kind of story was worth more than any act of violence could have been. In 1939, Patriarca married Helen G. Mandela. They would have a son, Raymond Patriarca Jr., whose own story and whose own struggles would become central to the second half of this saga. Decades later, through the 1940s, Patriarca continued his rise within the Providence faction's ranks, working as a captain, building relationships, and developing a network of jewel thieves and armed robbers whose proceeds flowed steadily upward through the organization's structure. According to one detailed account of this period, Patriarca's men carried out major jewelry scores, along with bank and armored car robberies, and he opened several gambling establishments in Providence and the surrounding area. At the same time, he was cultivating relationships outward with the Genovese family's Frank Costello in the gambling business, and eventually with the Colombo family in New York, ties that would give the Providence faction real standing within the broader National Mafia Commission structure. In 1950, mobster Philip Bucola fled the country to avoid prosecution for tax evasion. With Bucola effectively removed from the day-to-day picture, Patriarca took control of his criminal operations. It was the final, decisive step before Patriarca's formal ascension. On April 27, 1952, Bucola, who had not yet left for Sicily, though he eventually would in 1954, held a celebratory party in Johnston, Rhode Island, marking both his own retirement and Patriarca's rise to boss of the family. Bucola personally chose Patriarca as his successor and reportedly threw him a lavish party at his oceanside, Rhode Island mansion to mark the transition. Bucola would go on to retire to Sicily, where, according to multiple accounts, he spent his final decades running a chicken farm, an almost comically peaceful retirement for a man who had once commanded Boston's underworld. He died in 1987 at the age of 101, having outlived nearly everyone else in this story. While Bucola's formal departure for Sicily did not occur until 1954, Patriarca had effectively taken over the day-to-day running of the family's business by 1952, and it was around this time that his only meaningful local rival in Providence, an Irish bootlegger turned gambling boss named Carlton O'Brien, who had taken control of the area's horse racing wire service, was eliminated. Patriarca's men shot O'Brien to death in 1952. By the early 1950s, according to the historical record, it had become, in the words of one detailed account, impossible to be a major figure in crime in New England without having to deal with Raymond Patriarca in some fashion. In 1954, with Bucola's retirement to Sicily finally complete, Providence formally became the center of the New England family's operations, a symbolic and practical shift away from Boston that would define the organization's geography for the next 4 decades. And it was in 1956 that Patriarca made what historians describe as the single most significant change of his early reign. He relocated the family's base of operations to a specific building on Atwells Avenue in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood, a modest, wood frame, 2-story structure that housed 2 front businesses, a national cigarette service company and Coin-O-Matic distributors. A vending machine and pinball business, this building would become, in the language of the men who worked inside it, simply the office. Organized crime figures connected to Patriarca's operation were referred to, from this point forward, as members of the office, a phrase that would echo through FBI files, court transcripts, and newspaper headlines for the next 3 decades. Picture it, if you can, on a warm summer evening in the late 1950s. Atwells Avenue stretches out under string lights and the green, white, and red of an enormous painted pine cone arch that still spans the street today. Marking the entrance to Federal Hill, the sidewalks are full. Old men playing cards outside social clubs. Women carrying bags of groceries from the Italian market. Children weaving between adult legs on their way home from a stickball game. And there, outside a plain storefront stacked with cigarette cartons and pinball machines, stands a heavy-set man in a dark suit, cigar in hand, scanning the street with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has trained himself never to be surprised. This was, according to those who watched him over the years, Raymond Patriarca's preferred posture during the warmer months, standing outside his own front door, in plain sight, watching for any sign of police surveillance, content to let the entire neighborhood see exactly where he stood, because he had nothing, in his own mind, to hide. The Boston Globe, in a retrospective years later, described him this way. He scowled at strangers and at those who had fallen out of his favor, and he cursed newspapers, the FBI, and the late Robert F. Kennedy publicly. He denied ever being part of organized crime at all. It was a denial nobody believed, least of all the federal government, but it was a denial he would maintain, with remarkable consistency for the rest of his life. And so, by the middle of the 1950s, the structure of what would soon be known across the country as the Patriarca crime family was essentially complete. A boss in Providence, with deep ties into both the New York Commission and a growing network of captains across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine. What remained to be built, and what Patriarca would spend the rest of the decade constructing with the same patience he had shown his entire life, was the internal architecture of rules, rackets, and loyalty that would let this organization function not as a loose collection of street crews, but as something closer to a disciplined, hierarchical institution, that architecture, and the uneasy peace it depended on, is where we turn next. How does a single man control criminal activity across 5 states without a standing army, without modern communication technology, and without ever putting his orders in writing? The answer, as Raymond Patriarca demonstrated for 3 decades, is fear braided tightly together with genuine, old-world respect, and a set of rules so clearly understood that they rarely needed to be spoken aloud at all. By the late 1950s, the Patriarca family's internal structure had settled into a shape that would remain largely consistent for the next 25 years. At the top sat Patriarca himself, based at the office on Atwells Avenue. Beneath him, the family operated through 2 geographic wings that mirrored its origins. A Providence faction, which Patriarca controlled most directly, and a Boston faction, run day to day by an underboss based in the North End. For that critical Boston post, Patriarca selected a man named Gennaro Jerry Angiulo, a protege of the family's longtime consigliere, Joseph J. L. Lombardo. It was a shrewd choice. Angiulo was a gifted earner with a sharp business mind, and his appointment effectively gave Patriarca a trusted, capable lieutenant managing the family's interests across the entire stretch from Boston to Worcester, while Patriarca focused his own attention on Providence, Rhode Island, and the wider commission politics of organized crime. For his underboss, in the more traditional sense, the man who stood beside him in Providence, Patriarca brought in Enrico Henry Tamaleo, sometimes called Henry the Referee, who had transferred over from the Bonanno crime family in New York, specifically to take this role. Tamaleo's arrival gave Patriarca something valuable: solid, direct lines of communication back to New York's 5 families, reinforcing the broader alliance structure Patriarca had been building with Frank Costello and, later, the Colombo family. According to research into the period, the National Mafia Commission formally agreed that Patriarca would control Boston, Providence, and the majority of New England as his territory, a recognition, at the highest levels of organized crime in America, that the New England operation was now a unified, commission-sanctioned family in its own right, not merely a junior outpost of New York's organizations. What did the family actually do, day to day, to generate its income? The honest, unglamorous answer is gambling. Above almost everything else, illegal sports betting, numbers games, dice games, high-stakes card rooms. These were the bread and butter of the Patriarca organization's economy, generating a steady, almost industrial flow of cash that dwarfed the more dramatic crimes the family is often remembered for. Layered on top of gambling was loan sharking, the practice of lending money at extortionate interest rates to gamblers, small business owners, and the desperate, with the implicit threat of violence standing behind every missed payment. The family also profited from trafficking in stolen goods, fencing operations that moved jewelry, electronics, and other merchandise lifted in burglaries and hijackings through a network of Patriarca-connected buyers, and, according to multiple historical accounts, from pornography distribution as one of its diversified revenue streams. Patriarca did not limit himself to the underworld economy alone. He diversified into legitimate or quasi-legitimate businesses as well, including restaurants, bars, and racetracks, at one point reportedly partnering in ventures in the Berkshires with, of all people, Frank Sinatra. He also held a financial stake in the Dunes Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, a connection that allowed him to benefit from what investigators called skimming, the practice of secretly diverting a portion of a foie. Casino's gambling revenue, before it was ever reported to tax authorities or ownership records, a scheme that, at various points in mid-century American organized crime, connected mob families across the country to the glittering legitimate facade of the Las Vegas Strip. There was also, according to testimony given years later, a far stranger episode tying Patriarca's network to international intrigue. In 1978, mob associate and eventual government witness Vincent Teresa testified that he was present in 1960 when the Central Intelligence Agency offered the Mafia a $4 million contract to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. According to that testimony, Patriarca helped select a Brookline, Massachusetts convict named Morris Pro Werner to carry out the killing, though the plot, according to the same testimony, was never actually carried out. It is worth flagging clearly. This account rests on testimony, not on a documented operational record, and it should be understood as alleged rather than proven in any court of law. But it speaks to just how far Patriarca's name had traveled by the start of the 1960s, far enough that organized crime researchers and even congressional investigators would, in later years, take seriously the idea that his organization had brushed up against Cold War-era intelligence operations. Patriarca ran his organization with what observers consistently described as ruthless, strict discipline, though notably, the FBI's own internal assessment of him in the mid-1950s did not initially categorize him as a violent gangster in the conventional sense. Instead, agency memos from that period describe him reaping a major cut from robberies and thefts across Rhode Island and other states, and functioning as the owner and financial backer of numerous gambling establishments throughout Rhode Island. Investigations also pointed to what one memo called a shakedown racket operating in the Federal Hill section of Providence. With young men pressuring local merchants for protection payments, there are darker stories too. That circulated about Patriarca's leadership style, stories that, in fairness, come down to us largely through allegation and informant testimony rather than courtroom-proven fact, and which should be read with that caveat firmly in mind. According to some accounts, Patriarca once ordered an elderly mobster to murder his own son after Patriarca had lost a substantial amount of money on a deal gone bad. The father reportedly pleaded for his son's life, and Patriarca ultimately relented, exiling the father from the family rather than forcing him to carry out the killing, a decision influenced, according to these accounts, by his underboss Henry Camaleo, who persuaded him to show mercy. In another episode, after federal authorities seized a hijacked shipment of cigarettes that Patriarca had financed, he allegedly demanded that several family members personally repay him $22,000 to cover his loss, a vivid illustration of how, in this world, financial discipline ran in only one direction, downward in expectation and upward in tribute. It was also during this period that Patriarca found himself, somewhat reluctantly, becoming a public figure of sorts, not by choice, but because the federal government had decided that organized crime in America deserved national attention, and Raymond Patriarca was about to become one of its most visible faces. In 1958, the United States Senate's McClellan Committee, formally investigating labor racketeering, summoned Patriarca to testify. Senators questioned him about allegations that he had used strong-arm tactics to push rival cigarette vending machine operators out of business. Patriarca denied it, and when pressed about the source of his evident wealth, he offered an answer that became something close to local legend. He claimed his success came from a shoebox containing $80,000 to $90,000 in cash, left to him from his mother's savings. Robert Kennedy, serving as the committee's chief counsel, asked Patriarca directly why he had turned to burglary as a young man. Patriarca's reply was almost philosophical in its evasiveness. Why do a lot of young fellows do a lot of things when they haven't a father? The following year, when Kennedy brought him before the commission again, Patriarca took a noticeably different approach than most organized crime figures of the era, who typically invoked their Fifth Amendment right to silence at every turn. Patriarca engaged directly with the questioning, describing himself, without apparent irony, as an honest businessman hounded by the police and the press for no good reason. In 1961, in a gesture that captured both his confidence and his theatrical sense of grievance, Patriarca took out a large advertisement in the Providence Journal Bulletin, specifically to complain about the newspaper's coverage of him, a real estate-sized rebuttal, printed and paid for, insisting that he was being unfairly persecuted. It is a small but telling detail. This was a man who, even as federal pressure mounted around him, still believed, or wanted the public to believe, that he was simply a misunderstood businessman, a victim of overzealous reporters and prosecutors, rather than the head of New England's most powerful criminal organization. But underneath this public posture of respectable indignation, the federal government's interest in Patriarca was deepening into something far more serious than newspaper scrutiny. By the early 1960s, the FBI had begun the kind of investigation that would eventually bring his entire operation crashing down, not through informants alone, though informants would play their part, but through a piece of hidden electronic equipment placed inside the walls of the office itself. The Quiet Dawn's rules, in other words, were about to run headlong into rules of an entirely different kind, the rules of federal surveillance law, just beginning to take modern shape in American courts. And while Patriarca stood outside his vending machine shop on warm afternoons, scanning the street for any sign of trouble, the real danger to his empire was already inside the building with him, recording every word. What happens when a single man decides he no longer wants to pay tribute to the most powerful boss in New England? In the summer of 1966, on a quiet Providence morning, the answer arrived in the form of 4 shotgun blasts inside a glass telephone booth. The man at the center of this story was William "Willie" Marfeo, a Providence bookmaker and dice game operator who ran an independent gambling operation on Federal Hill. Independent, crucially, in the sense that he had stopped paying Patriarca his expected cut, according to wiretap transcripts and testimony from informants gathered during this period. Patriarca's desire to have Marfeo killed dated back to at least the summer of 1964, 2 full years before the murder actually took place. The delay, according to these accounts, had less to do with mercy than with logistics. Patriarca's underboss Henry Tamaleo was dealing with his own tax problems at the time, and that distraction reportedly pushed the Marfeo situation onto the back burner for a while. There was also, simmering underneath, the simple matter of unpaid tribute, a personal grievance. Willie Marfeo had, at some point, physically assaulted Tamaleo, an act of disrespect that, within the rigid hierarchy of the office, was considered every bit as serious as the financial slight. A man who would strike the family's underboss and who would refuse to pay his required cut from an illegal gambling operation was, in the language of this world, a problem that needed solving. On the morning of July 13th, 1966, Willie Marfeo was sitting in the corner kitchen, a small Providence restaurant, enjoying coffee and conversation with 2 companions and the restaurant's owner. A lone gunman walked through the front door, ordered the other men in the room to lie face down on the floor, and then forced Marfeo outside at gunpoint. Just beyond the restaurant's entrance stood a glass telephone booth, the old kind, with a folding door and a coin slot, the sort of structure that, in the 1960s, stood on nearly every American street corner. The gunman pushed Marfeo inside it and opened fire. Marfeo was shot once in the head, once in the shoulder, once in the chest, and once in the torso. Bullets were later found lodged in his brain, his lungs, and his spleen. The 3 witnesses inside the restaurant told police afterward that they had never seen the killer before and could not provide a clear description. The aftermath rippled outward through Marfeo's own family with an almost biblical weight. That same afternoon, his brother Thomas was hospitalized with hysteria after hearing the news. Another brother, Savino, suffered a heart attack after a scuffle with police while reacting to news of Willie's death, and remained hospitalized for weeks. It was a pattern of grief and physical collapse that would, tragically, repeat itself within the same family less than 2 years later, when violence struck the Mafios for a second time. Investigators and federal prosecutors would eventually allege that Raymond Patriarca had ordered Willie Marfio's killing specifically because Marfeo had refused to pay tribute from his unsanctioned dice and bookmaking operation, based largely on testimony from a hitman turned government informant, a man whose story will occupy much of our next chapter. Patriarca and Henry Tamaleo were indicted in 1967 on charges of conspiracy to commit murder in connection with Marfio's death. It would take years for that case to wind its way fully through the courts. But the killing of Willie Marfeo, in retrospect, marks the moment when the slow unraveling of Raymond Patriarca's empire truly began. The violence, however, did not end with Willie. Less than 2 years later, on the Saturday after Easter, April 20th, 1968, just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Willie's younger brother Rudolph, Rudy Marfeo, and his associate Anthony Malay were shot to death inside Pannoni's Market, a grocery store at 282 Pocasset Avenue in Providence's Silver Lake section. According to court records from the case, it had become Rudy Marfeo's custom to shop at that particular market on Saturday afternoons, a routine. Tragically, that made him an easy and predictable target. 2 masked gunmen entered the store and opened fire on both men. Anthony Malay was shot from a distance of roughly 6 feet near the store's ice cream freezer. Rudy Marfeo was shot from about 3 feet away, near the front door, his own pistol still in his hand. The weapons used were a carbine rifle and a shotgun. Medical examiners later recovered 15 lead fragments from Marfeo's body and 4 from Malay's. Prosecutors alleged, and Patriarca was eventually charged with conspiring, that Rudy Marfeo and Anthony Malay were killed in retaliation for their attempts to avenge Willie's murder and for shaking down bookies and loan sharks who, in the language of the office, belonged to Patriarca, meaning they operated under his protection and owed him a cut. It is worth noting, in the interest of factual precision, that some later research into this case has raised questions and competing theories about the underlying motive, including suggestions of a more personal dispute connected to a relationship Rudy Marfeo was having at the time, where the documented historical record offers competing explanations rather than a single settled truth. It is more honest to say that prosecutors built their case around the tribute and revenge theory, rather than to present that theory as the unquestioned final word on the matter. The investigation into the Marfeo-Malay killings moved with surprising speed by the standards of organized crime cases. Indictments followed within about a year, naming Patriarca alongside several other men, including Morris Pro Lerner, Robert Fairbrother's, John Rossi, and Rudolph Ciara. According to Rhode Island Supreme Court records from related appeals, separate indictments charged Patriarca and Ciara as accessories to the murders of both Rudy Marfeo and Anthony Malay, while Lerner, Fairbrother's, and Rossi were charged directly with the murders themselves. Picture, for a moment, the texture of Federal Hill in the wake of these 2 killings. The pinball machines on Etwells Avenue still clattered through their cycles. The cigarette cartons still moved through the front of the coin-o-matic shop. But underneath that surface of ordinary commerce, something had shifted permanently. The office's rules, the unwritten, unspoken code by which independent operators either paid their tribute or faced consequences, had now been enforced twice. In public, in broad daylight, with a violence pointed enough that everyone on the street, understood exactly what message was being sent. And yet, in enforcing those rules so visibly, Patriarca had also handed federal and state prosecutors precisely what they needed: a pattern, a motive, and soon enough, a witness willing to describe it all under oath. That witness, a man whose nickname alone tells you most of what you need to know about his reputation, is where our story turns next. His name was Joseph Barboza, and the choices he made in the years following these murders would do more to bring down the Patriarca family's first great era of dominance than any rival gang, any rival family, or any single act of violence ever could. What does it take to turn a feared killer into a star witness for the federal government? Sometimes, as it turned out in this case, all it takes is a single recording, played back at exactly the right moment, of a man's own boss calling him expendable. Joseph Barboza Jr. was born on September 20th, 1932, and grew up to become, by the mid-1960s, one of the most feared enforcers and contract killers in Boston's underworld, a man nicknamed the Animal for the sheer brutality of his work. Though he was of Portuguese rather than Italian-American descent, which meant he could never be formally inducted as a made member of the Mafia itself, Barboza nonetheless functioned as a prominent hitman and loan collector for the Patriarca organization throughout the 1960s, and he would later claim responsibility for as many as 26 murders carried out during Boston's brutal gang wars of that decade. By January of 1966, Barboza had built himself into a powerful figure in the Boston underworld in his own right. But his standing within the organization began to deteriorate that same year. In October 1966, he was arrested in Boston's notorious combat zone on a concealed weapons charge. With bond set at $100,000, an enormous sum, Barboza grew increasingly anxious as the weeks passed, and Patriarca and Angiulo failed to post his bail. Two of his friends, Arthur Tash Ratsos and Thomas J. DePrisco Jr., scraped together $59,000 in an effort to help free him, money they had apparently raised, in part through a fundraising visit to a cafe managed by an associate named Rafi Chang Lamatina. Both men were shot to death and dumped in South Boston, in what was made to look like the work of a rival Irish gang. The $59,000 they had raised on Barboza's behalf went missing along with them. It is hard to overstate how that episode must have felt from Barboza's perspective, sitting in jail while two of the men trying to help him were murdered, and the very organization he had killed for showing no urgency to bail him out. According to multiple historical accounts, FBI agents Dennis Condon and H. Paul Rico visited Barboza around this time and played for him a recording gathered through the same wiretap operation that had been monitoring Patriarca's Atwell's Avenue office, in which Patriarca could be heard, referring to Barboza as a bum and as expendable. For a man already feeling abandoned by his own crew, hearing his boss dismiss him in those exact terms appears to have been the final push. Barboza agreed to become an informant in exchange for immunity, protection for his family, and, as he put it, the chance to get even with an organization he now felt had betrayed him. In June 1967, while still imprisoned on weapons charges, Barboza formally turned, beginning a relationship with federal law enforcement that would reshape organized crime prosecution across the country. On June 20th, 1967, based largely on Barboza's account, Patriarca and Henry Tamaleo were indicted for conspiracy to murder in connection with the 1966 killing of Willie Marfeo. Weeks later, in August, Gennaro Angiulo was accused of involvement in a separate gangland killing, and in October, 6 men were charged in connection with the March 1965 murder of a small-time Boston thug named Edward Teddy Deegan, a case that would, in time, become one of the most consequential wrongful conviction scandals in the history of American law enforcement. We need to pause here and walk through the Deegan case carefully, because it intersects directly with the Patriarca family's senior leadership, and because what eventually came to light about it stands as one of the gravest known failures of federal law enforcement integrity in this entire story. In May 1968, the Deegan murder trial began in Massachusetts. After 50 days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts. Sentenced to death were Peter Limon, Louis Greco, Henry Tamaleo, Patriarca's own underboss, and Ronald Casesso. Sentenced to life in prison were Joseph Salvati and Wilfred Roy French, Barboza himself. Despite having been deeply involved in the underworld activity surrounding the case, received only a 1-year prison term, time served included. It would take decades and an extraordinary amount of digging by journalists, defense attorneys, and eventually federal judges to fully expose what had actually happened. According to findings later affirmed in federal court, of the 6 men convicted in the Deegan killing, only 2, Ronald Casesso and Wilfred Roy French, had actually been present in the alley where the murder took place. The other 4, Limon, Greco, Tamaleo, and Salvati, had played no role in the crime at all. FBI Agent H. Paul Rico, according to a federal court's later findings, had helped engineer false testimony from Barboza that named these 4 men, in order to protect the real participants in the killing, among them a man named Vincent Jimmy Flemmy, who happened to be a valuable FBI informant the Bureau did not want exposed or prosecuted. A federal judge, reviewing the case decades later in a civil suit brought by the wrongfully convicted men and their families, found that FBI records and wiretap evidence, including material gathered from the very same Patriarca wire that had turned Barboza into an informant in the first place, had confirmed all along that the real killers were Barboza, Flemmy, and 3 others, not the men sent to prison. The court further found that agents had known specifically that Limon had been overheard warning Deegan that Flemmy wanted him dead, that Salvati's name had never even surfaced in the FBI's files until Barboza suddenly produced it, and that Greco and Tamaleo had never been linked to the Deegan murder by any other piece of evidence the Bureau possessed. Despite all of this, the court found the FBI persisted in encouraging and rewarding Barboza's cooperation rather than correcting the record. The human cost of this failure was staggering. Henry Tamaleo died in prison in 1985. Having served 18 years for a murder a federal court would later determine he did not commit. Louis Greco died in prison in 1995. After 28 years of incarceration, Joseph Salvati's sentence was eventually commuted in 1997, after he had served a little more than 29 years. Peter Limon was not released until 2001. After 33 years behind bars, their convictions were vacated that same year, following newly disclosed FBI documents confirming the perjured nature of Barboza's original account. In 2007, United States District Judge Nancy Gertner awarded $101.7 million in damages to the survivors and the estates of the deceased, finding that FBI agents had knowingly allowed Barboza's lies to stand, prioritizing the protection of their informants over the basic demands of justice. When questioned about the case during congressional hearings in 2003, Agent Rico, by then elderly, responded to the human cost of his actions with a single, infamous line, "What do you want, tears?" We tell this part of the story at some length, not because it is a digression from the history of the Patriarca family, but because it is woven directly into it. Henry Tamaleo was not a peripheral figure. He was Raymond Patriarca's own underboss, the man brought in from the Bonanno family, specifically to anchor Patriarca's connections to New York. His wrongful conviction and death in prison stand as one of the most documented and devastating consequences of the Barboza era. A reminder that the federal government's pursuit of organized crime in this period was not always conducted with clean hands, and that the human toll of these years extended well beyond the men who were, by any fair measure, actually guilty. Returning to the Maffeo case directly, in the first trial, connected to Barboza's testimony, Gennaro Angiulo was found not guilty after a jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. None of the jurors, according to accounts of the case, found Barboza personally credible, but the second trial, focused specifically on the killing of Willie Maffeo, produced a different result. Raymond Patriarca was found guilty of conspiracy to murder Willie Maffeo. He was sentenced in 1968 to a term that several sources describe somewhat differently. Accounts place the sentence at 5 years in one telling and 10 years in another, reflecting how the case moved through multiple related indictments and appeals over the following years. But in every account, the outcome was the same. For the first time in his career as boss, Raymond Patriarca was going to federal prison, and a hitman he had once dismissed on tape as expendable had been the one to put him there. He did not go quietly, and the consequences of that conviction would ripple forward for years. Through a second Maffeo-related trial in 1970, through Patriarca's continued efforts to run his organization from behind bars, and eventually through a campaign of intimidation and violence aimed squarely at the man whose testimony had started it all, we will follow Patriarca's imprisonment and the strange continuity of his criminal command even while incarcerated in a chapter ahead. But first, it is worth marking just how dangerous Barboza's decision to testify made his own life. Patriarca, according to multiple accounts, allegedly sought to hire snipers on speedboats in an attempt to kill Barboza, while federal marshals transported him by water to testify in court, an arrangement made necessary because Barboza was being housed, for his own protection, on the remote, windswept Thacker Island off Cape Ann. He was later moved repeatedly between secure locations, including Fort Devens in Massachusetts and even Fort Knox, Kentucky, in an effort to keep him alive long enough to testify. The man tasked with protecting him, U.S. Deputy Marshal John Partington, would later be credited with helping launch what eventually became the Federal Witness Protection Program, a system built, in significant part, out of the sheer scale of effort required to keep Joseph Barboza breathing long enough to take the stand against Raymond Patriarca. The wiretap had given the government its evidence. The witness had given them their case. What remained was the slow, grinding machinery of trial, conviction, and appeal, and the question of whether a man as powerful as Patriarca could really be kept behind bars for long. Can a man run a criminal empire from inside a federal prison cell? For Raymond Patriarca, the answer, for the better part of 6 years, was yes. Following his 1968 conviction in the Maffeo conspiracy case, Patriarca's legal troubles only deepened. A second major case arose from the 1968 killings of Rudy Maffeo and Anthony Millay inside Pennoni's Market. According to Rhode Island Supreme Court records, separate indictments in June 1969 named Patriarca as a defendant alongside Morris Lerner, Robert Fairbrother's, John Rossi, and Rudolph Ciara. Patriarca and Ciara faced charges as accessories to both murders, while Lerner, Fairbrother's, and Rossi were charged as the actual killers. This second trial, which finally reached its conclusion in 1970, again rested heavily on testimony from a cooperating witness, in this instance, a man named John Red Kelly, an Irish-American mobster and occasional Patriarca associate, who had been handled by the same FBI agent, H. Paul Rico, whose conduct in the Deegan case we examined in the previous chapter. Kelly testified that he had been contracted by Morris Lerner to help kill Marfaio and Malay. The jury's verdict in 1970 convicted Patriarca and his associates of conspiracy to commit murder. Lerner was additionally convicted on 2 direct counts of murder, for which he received 2 consecutive life sentences on top of his conspiracy sentence. The jury, notably, was unable to reach a verdict for the other 4 defendants in that round of charges. Patriarca himself was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. It is worth noting, in the interest of full accuracy, that Lerner's conviction was later quashed by the Rhode Island Supreme Court in 1988, after it was established that both Kelly and Agent Rico had committed perjury during the original trial. Yet another example, alongside the Deacon case, of how thoroughly some of the convictions secured against the Patriarca organization during this era were built on testimony that would not survive later scrutiny. The court vacated the conviction and ordered a new trial, though by that point, nearly 2 decades had already passed. Patriarca began serving his sentence around 1969, ultimately serving time at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. And here we arrive at one of the more remarkable details of this entire history. Even from inside prison, Patriarca did not relinquish control of his organization. According to multiple historical accounts, he continued to run the family while incarcerated, communicating through visits, intermediaries, and the simple fact that everyone within the organization understood his authority had not actually ended, just because his physical address had changed. During this period, Gennaro Angiulo served as acting boss, managing the day-to-day operations of the Boston wing and reporting, however, indirectly, back to Patriarca. Patriarca completed his federal sentence in April 1973 and was then transferred to a Rhode Island state facility to address his remaining state-level obligations connected to the Marfaio Malay case. He remained there until he was paroled on January 9, 1975. By most accounts, the years of imprisonment had not meaningfully diminished his authority within the organization. He resumed control of the family almost immediately upon his release, stepping back into the same role at the same 12th Avenue office, as though the intervening years had been little more than an inconvenient pause. But there was unfinished business waiting for him, and for Joseph Barboza, whose testimony had set this entire chain of events in motion. Barboza, after his cooperation with prosecutors concluded, had been relocated under the witness protection arrangements then still in their infancy, eventually settling in California under the alias Joe Donati. In the town of Santa Rosa, he had not entirely escaped trouble. In 1971, while using the alias Joseph Perrin, he was arrested in California for the murder of a Providence nightclub owner. According to FBI records from the period, Barboza threatened to expose fabricated elements of his earlier testimony unless his federal handlers intervened on his behalf. In this new case, the Bureau did intervene, lobbying prosecutors for a reduced charge, and Barboza ultimately pleaded to second-degree murder, receiving a sentence of 5 years to life. When his first parole hearing arrived 5 years later, federal representatives again appeared as character witnesses on his behalf, and once more, the effort succeeded. Barboza was released from prison in November 1975. He did not have long to enjoy his freedom. Barboza moved to San Francisco, and on February 11, 1976, just 4 months after his release, he went to visit an old friend and mob associate named James Chalmers in the city's quiet Sunset District. According to accounts of his death, Chalmers had, unbeknownst to Barboza, tipped off Patriarca family underboss Gennaro Angiulo to Barboza's location. Angiulo dispatched Caporegime Ilario Larry Zanino and a mob soldier named Joseph Russo to watch for Barboza's departure from Chalmers' residence near the corner of 25th Avenue and Moraga Street. As Barboza approached his parked car and reached for his keys, a van pulled up rapidly, and from a distance of nearly point-blank range. 4 shotgun blasts were fired through its open door. Barboza was killed instantly. His death is widely understood, according to multiple historical accounts, to have been carried out at the behest of the Patriarca organization, in direct retaliation for the testimony that had sent its boss to prison nearly a decade earlier. Though, in keeping with the broader pattern of this story, it should be noted that this conclusion rests on the accumulated weight of investigative reporting and law enforcement belief rather than on a courtroom conviction specifically, establishing Patriarca's personal order for the hit. There is a grim symmetry worth sitting with for a moment. Patriarca had been released from prison in January 1975, having served roughly 4 years for Willie Marfio's murder. He would go on, according to multiple accounts, to die a free man of natural causes years later, while Barboza, the man whose testimony had cost Patriarca those years of liberty, was dead within 4 months of his own release, gunned down on a quiet residential street 3,000 miles from the city where the entire chain of events had begun. The wiretap had exposed the office. The witness had broken its silence, and in the end, the office had reached across the entire country to make certain that silence was permanently restored, at least with regard to Joseph Barboza himself, through the remainder of the 1970s and into the early 1980s. Patriarca continued to run his organization much as he always had, gambling, loan sharking, the steady extraction of tribute, the careful cultivation of political and law enforcement relationships. But the federal government's appetite for organized crime prosecutions had only grown sharper since the Barboza era, not duller, and new investigative tools, improved wiretap law, the still developing framework of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO, were quietly being assembled, tool by tool, by federal prosecutors who had learned a great deal from the mistakes and successes of the Marfeo and Deegan cases. Patriarca's final years, as we will see, would be defined by an unrelenting series of legal pressures, even as his physical health began to fail him. And while the aging boss fought these final legal battles from Providence, 200 miles north, in Boston's North End, his Boston underboss, Jerry Angiulo, was running an operation so confident in its own untouchability that it would soon hand the FBI one of the most consequential pieces of evidence in the history of American organized crime prosecution. A quiet moment before we continue, if this story has settled into a good rhythm for you. A like on this video helps more people find it, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one. No need to do anything else, just rest and let's keep going. What does overconfidence sound like, recorded on tape, for a federal jury to hear years later? In Boston's North End, it sounded like a small, sharp-tongued man with a booming voice, holding court every evening in a building his own family had owned for decades, certain that no one would ever dare listen in. Gennaro Jerry Angiulo was born on March 20th, 1919, in Boston's North End, to Italian immigrants Cesare and Giovannina Angiulo, who owned a modest convenience store and luncheonette on Prince Street. Angiulo grew up surrounded by his siblings, Niccolo, Donato, Francesco, Antonio, Michelle, and James, in the same dense, close-knit Italian neighborhood that had produced so many of this story's earlier figures. He graduated from Boston English High School in 1936, reportedly with ambitions of attending law school and becoming a criminal defense attorney, an almost poetic detail, given how much of his later life would be spent in courtrooms, just on the opposite side of the bar from where he had once imagined himself standing. Instead, he enlisted in the United States Navy at the start of World War II, served 4 years of combat duty in the Pacific Theater, and returned to the North End at the war's end to be drawn. Alongside his brothers, into Boston's underworld. The path in was almost mundane in its origins. Local authorities had been cracking down on operators of the so-called Italian lottery, and that crackdown created an opening. The Angiulo brothers found local businesses willing to serve as fronts for bookmaking operations, offering those businesses discounted odds in exchange for their cover, and reinvesting the resulting profits into legitimate-seeming ventures like nightclubs to launder the money. The dominant patriarchal organization eventually absorbed the brothers into its structure, inducting them as members and taking its expected cut of their growing action. By 1963, Patriarca's confidence in Angiulo's business acumen and his successful racketeering had grown, to the point where he appointed Angiulo underboss of the entire Providence-based family, a position that effectively put Angiulo in command of the family's business interests across the corridor, running from Boston to Worcester. Angiulo and his brothers ran their operation out of a building at 98 Prince Street in the North End, the very same building, in fact, where the Angiulo family's parents had once run their luncheonette. The brothers nicknamed it the Dog House, and it became, in every practical sense, the Boston equivalent of Patriarca's Atwell's Avenue office. Angiulo became, by any measure, a multi-millionaire. He lived in a beachfront mansion in the suburb of Nahant and drove around in a Jeep that, in a flourish of pure swagger, bore the license plate Italian Stallion. His closest capo, a man named Ilario Leri Zanino, provided the muscle that backed up Angiulo's business decisions when persuasion alone wasn't sufficient. And Angiulo himself developed a reputation, even among rival gangsters and law enforcement, as a shrewd, wisecracking, almost theatrical figure, a man who, despite standing only 5 feet 7 inches tall, commanded rooms with a booming voice and a quick, biting wit. It was precisely this comfort, this sense of being untouchable inside his own headquarters, that proved to be Angiulo's undoing. Beginning around 1979, an FBI agent named Bill Shopro developed a system for monitoring the entrance to 98 Prince Street using a camera positioned in a parked car nearby. By 1980, the Bureau's attention turned toward getting audio coverage inside the building itself, and it took roughly a year of legal and technical preparation to make that happen. There is an uncomfortable layer to how that surveillance operation actually came together, one that connects directly to a far darker story unfolding in Boston at the same time, the story of James Whitey Bulger and his Winter Hill gang, who had, by this point, become deeply compromised informants for corrupt elements within the FBI's Boston field office. According to testimony and documents that came to light years later in federal court, Bulger and his associate Stephen Flemmi visited Angiulo's headquarters at 98 Prince Street at the request of their FBI handlers, ostensibly just to confirm whether the building had a security alarm system. They could not determine that, but they did return to their handlers with a hand-drawn floor plan of the Angiulo brothers' office, information that directly assisted the FBI's placement of its listening devices. When the Bureau formally submitted its application for the surveillance operation to the court, Bulger was listed among the informants whose information supported the request. It is worth pausing on the strangeness of that arrangement. The same federal government that was, at this very moment, building one of the most significant organized crime cases in New England, history was simultaneously protecting and relying upon a violent criminal organization of its own, one that would later be revealed to have committed numerous murders. With tacit federal protection, this pattern of compromised, ethically fraught BI conduct, which we have already seen in the Deegan wrongful conviction case, recurs throughout this story, not as an isolated scandal, but as something closer to a structural feature of how organized crime enforcement in Boston actually operated during these decades. We raise this not to excuse anything the Patriarca organization itself did, but because an honest telling of this history requires acknowledging that the institutions hunting them were, themselves, frequently far from clean, starting in January 1981. FBI agents listened in, day after day, as Angiulo's younger brother Frankie opened the office each morning, a creature of habit by all accounts, a smoker who could be heard coughing and spitting into the sink before putting on a pot of coffee. Other brothers cycled through during the day. Bookmakers arrived carrying enormous amounts of cash. Around 4 in the afternoon, Gennaro Angiulo himself would typically arrive in a red 2-door AMC Pacer, bearing his own name on the license plate. And for the next several hours, he would hold forth on whatever business needed attending to, until roughly 7:30 in the evening, at which point, in a detail almost too human and ordinary to invent, the boss would quiet the room so that everyone present could watch public television together. For 103 days, this rhythm continued. The FBI's recording equipment capturing an extraordinary archive of organized crime's internal operations, gambling business, loan sharking arrangements, and eventually, something far more damning, one taped conversation captured Angiulo discussing the planned killing of a witness with chilling, almost bureaucratic casualness. I hope it happens tonight. Just hit him in the head and stab him, okay? The jeopardy is just a little too much for me. You understand, American? Okay, let's go. That particular plot was thwarted only because the FBI, having captured the conversation, warned the intended victim in time. In May 1981, after 4 months of listening, the FBI raided 98 Prince Street. Technical agents discovered a safe wedged into an upstairs fireplace and had to call in a locksmith and, eventually, a sledgehammer to open it. The raid, and the case it eventually produced, would not result in formal arrests for more than 2 years. Angiulo was not taken into custody until September 19, 1983, alongside his brothers Francesco and Michel, in a scene that, by most accounts, Angiulo met with characteristic bravado, reportedly shouting, as he was led away in handcuffs, that he would be back before his pork chops got cold. He would not be back, held without bail awaiting trial. Angiulo's case finally went before a jury in a highly publicized 8-month trial that concluded in February 1986. Jurors heard hours of the taped conversations recorded at Prince Street, detailing plans for murder, gambling operations, loan sharking, and extortion. In one especially memorable taped exchange, played for the jury, Angiulo could be heard telling Zanino, "I wouldn't be in legitimate business for all the money in the world. We're Shylocks. We're bookmakers. We're selling marijuana. We're illegal here. Illegal there. Arsonists. We're every fucking thing." It was, in its own dark way, an unintentional confession of remarkable completeness. Angiulo was convicted on an extensive list of charges: racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and obstruction of justice among them, and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. He would serve a significant portion of that sentence at the Federal Prison Hospital in Devens, Massachusetts, eventually being paroled on September 10, 2007. After 24 years behind bars, he died, a free man, on August 29, 2009, at the age of 90, of renal failure connected to kidney disease, having outlived nearly the entire generation of mobsters who had once filled the doghouse on Prince Street with cigarette smoke and the murmur of business. Being conducted in low, confident voices, a retired Massachusetts state police colonel, reflecting on Angiulo's career after his death, called him probably the last truly significant mafia boss in Boston's history, a man whose downfall, in retrospect, marked the symbolic end of an entire era of organized crime operating in Plain. almost theatrical confidence on a single North End Street corner. But while Angiulo's case was still working its way through the federal court system in the mid-1980s, an event of far greater significance to the overall fate of the Patriarca family had already occurred 200 miles south. In Providence, the man who had built this entire empire, who had survived prison, parole, and decades of federal scrutiny, was about to die, and the question of who would replace him would prove to be the single greatest miscalculation in the family's entire history. How do you measure the end of an era? Sometimes it arrives in a single ordinary moment, an emergency call placed from an address on a quiet residential street. On an otherwise unremarkable July morning by the early 1980s, Raymond Patriarca was an old man by the standards of his violent profession, and his body was beginning to fail him in ways that even his formidable will could not overcome. He suffered from heart disease and diabetes for years, conditions that, ironically, would become one of his most reliable legal defenses in his final seasons of life. Legal pressure, however, never let up. In December 1983, Patriarca was charged with ordering the 1965 murder of a Providence wise guy named Raymond "Baby Ray" Curcio, who had reportedly burglarized the home of Patriarca's own brother, Joseph. Then, on March 13, 1984, while he was already hospitalized for his declining health, Patriarca was arrested again, this time for allegedly ordering the 1968 murder of a bank robber named Robert Candos, whom Patriarca apparently believed was preparing to testify against him. In both cases, Patriarca's attorneys successfully argued that his deteriorating heart condition made him unfit to stand trial. And in both cases, judges agreed. It is a final, fitting irony of his career. A man who had spent decades carefully managing risk, avoiding unnecessary exposure, and using every available form of leverage, financial, political, and legal, to stay one step ahead of prosecution, ultimately escaped his last courtroom battles not through cunning, but through the simple, undeniable fact of his own failing heart. On July 11, 1984, at approximately 11:30 in the morning, the North Providence Fire Department's rescue squad received an emergency call from an address on Douglas Avenue, the home of his girlfriend, where Patriarca had been staying. He had suffered a heart attack and was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Raymond Loretta Salvatore Patriarca was 76 years old. He was buried at Gate of Heaven Cemetery in East Providence, Rhode Island, closing the book on more than 3 decades of nearly unbroken command over organized crime throughout New England. It is worth taking a moment, before we move forward, to sit with the scale of what had just ended. For more than 30 years, through Senate hearings, FBI wiretaps, 2 major murder conspiracy convictions, a federal prison sentence, and a parade of informants and turncoats, Raymond Patriarca had remained the unquestioned head of an organization that stretched across 5 states. He had survived the era of Joseph Barboza. He had survived the death of his own underboss's reputation in the Deegan scandal. He had survived imprisonment itself, running his family's business from behind prison walls, as though geography were merely an inconvenience, whatever else might be said about the harm his organization caused. And that harm, as we have seen, was real and considerable. His longevity as a boss was, by any standard within his own violent profession, extraordinary, but longevity in command does not guarantee wisdom in succession. And it was here, at the very moment of his death, that Raymond Patriarca made what many historians and law enforcement officials consider the single most consequential misjudgment of his entire career. He had already arranged, before his death, for his own son to take over as boss. Raymond Joseph Patriarca, known to nearly everyone as Raymond Jr. Patriarca, was born in Providence, Rhode Island, on February 24, 1945, to Raymond Cr. and Helen Mandela, who had died of cancer in 1965. Junior had grown up entirely within the shadow of his father's reputation, a position that, according to virtually every account of his subsequent tenure as boss, brought him respect by inheritance, rather than respect earned through the kind of decades-long demonstration of capability that had built his father's authority in the first place. Upon Raymond Sr.'s death, his underboss situation was already complicated. Gennaro Angiulo, who might otherwise have been a natural successor, given his decades of service and demonstrated business acumen, was by this point incarcerated on the racketeering charges stemming from the Prince Street wiretap, and he reportedly attempted to assert a claim to the bossship despite being behind bars, an effort that ultimately went nowhere. Instead, the family's most powerful remaining capo, Ilario Larry Zanino, threw his support behind the younger Patriarca. With that backing in place, and with the additional approval of the National Mafia Commission, secured, according to historical accounts, with support from the Gambino crime family in New York, Raymond Patriarca Jr.'s position as the new boss of the family was formally confirmed. It did not take long for the cracks in this arrangement to show. Junior Patriarca, whatever his other qualities, lacked his father's particular combination of menace, business discipline, and political instinct, the very qualities that had allowed Raymond Sr. to hold an entire 5-state criminal organization together through sheer force of personal authority for over 3 decades. Almost immediately, the organization Junior inherited began to show signs of internal strain that his father's iron grip had, for years, simply suppressed rather than resolved. There is a particularly revealing episode from 1986 that illustrates just how exposed Junior's position had become. Even on matters of public reputation, that year, he testified before the Judiciary Committee of the Rhode Island House of Representatives during impeachment proceedings against Rhode Island Supreme Court Chief Justice Joseph A. Bevilacqua Sr., a former criminal defense attorney who stood accused of improperly associating with organized crime figures. The hearings ultimately led to Bevilacqua's resignation. During the proceedings, prosecutors introduced FBI wiretap recordings of conversations involving Patriarca Sr. that had been captured between 1962 and 1965, recordings in which, according to the FBI's own logs, Raymond Sr. could be heard advising his son to marry an Italian girl when the time came, on the reasoning that such a wife would stand by him in trouble and would not call the police if he ever struck her. Confronted with this material in front of the press, Junior Patriarca felt compelled to publicly apologize on his father's behalf, telling reporters that his father had never told him anything about hitting or otherwise mistreating women. It is a small, uncomfortable scene, but a telling one. Here was the new boss of one of America's most significant organized crime families, forced into a public reckoning, not with his own criminal conduct, but with decades-old recordings of his deceased father's casual cruelty, a sign of just how thoroughly the federal government's surveillance apparatus, built up across the 1960s and 1970s, specifically to bring down Raymond Sr., continued to haunt the organization's image and operations long after his death. Junior Patriarca's 6 years as boss, from 1984 until his eventual stepping down in 1991, would be remembered by almost every historian of this period, not for any expansion of the family's power, but for the opposite, a slow, then sudden, then catastrophic unraveling. The internal discipline that his father had maintained for 3 decades through fear, respect, and an unmatched personal track record began to dissolve. Ambitious captains who might never have dared challenge Raymond Sr. began to see, in his son's evidently weaker grip, an opportunity, and the underboss eventually chosen to help steady the ship, a volatile former soulmate of Raymond Sr. named William "Billy the Wild Man" Grasso, would, within just a few years, become the first body to fall in a civil war that would tear the organization apart from the inside. That war, and the violence it unleashed across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, is where our story now turns. What happens to a criminal organization when the fear that once held it together quietly begins to evaporate? In the case of the Patriarca family during the late 1980s, the answer was blood. First one man's, then dozens more, spilled across 3 states in a war that the family's nominal boss seemed powerless to stop. William Grasso, known within the underworld as Billy the Wild Man, was born on January 6, 1927, and raised in New Haven, Connecticut. His criminal career began in the early 1950s, with his first arrest for petty assault, recorded in 1951. By the late 1960s, Grasso was running dice games in street loans in New Haven under a Colombo crime family capo named Ralph Whitey Tropiano, work that led to his 1968 conviction on extortion and conspiracy charges and a 10-year prison sentence, of which he ultimately served roughly 5 years. Being released in 1973, it was during this incarceration at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta that Grasso formed a close personal alliance with Raymond Patriarca Sr, who was serving his own sentence there at the same time, a relationship that would prove decisive in propelling Grasso's later rise within the organization. Following his parole, Grasso consolidated power in New Haven, running a major illegal gambling operation that included a high-stakes craps game on Forbes Avenue with a $50,000 bankroll, reportedly one of the largest such games operating between New York and Boston. He built out a portfolio of loan sharking, extortion, and waste-hauling rackets used as fronts for his activities, and he removed rivals along the way, including the 1979 killing of an independent Connecticut mobster named Salvatore Midge Renault, Annunziato, and in 1980, the killing of his own former mentor, Ralph Tropiano, as Grasso shifted his formal allegiance from the Colombo family to Patriarca's organization and was inducted as a made member. By the early 1980s, Grasso had risen to underboss of the entire Patriarca family, a position that, following Raymond Sr.'s death in 1984, made him, in the eyes of many law enforcement officials, the organization's real working leader, regardless of what title Junior Patriarca technically held. Grasso's reputation was built on unrelenting brutality rather than the careful, businesslike discipline that had defined Raymond Sr. Its decades in charge, he was, by virtually every account from this period, a man whose greed and overreach generated resentment even among his own organization's members, resentment that became impossible to ignore once Grasso began encroaching on established rackets, including vending machine territories that other Patriarca family members in Massachusetts and Connecticut considered their own. According to later research into the case, Grasso survived at least 3 prior assassination attempts before the one that finally succeeded. The killing itself, when it came, was carried out with a coldness that mirrored Grasso's own reputation. He was lured under the pretext of attending an underworld meeting in Worcester, Massachusetts, ostensibly to discuss vending machine territory in Springfield with a Genovese family capo named Carlo Mastrodoraro. He was picked up in a van driven by an associate named Louis Pugliano. As the vehicle traveled along Interstate 91 in Connecticut, a man named Gaetano Gino Milano, seated directly behind Grasso, fired a single .32 caliber bullet into the back of his neck at the base of his skull. The killers then dumped Grasso's body along the west bank of the Connecticut River in Wethersfield, Connecticut, where it was discovered on June 16, 1989. According to multiple historical accounts, the underlying cause of Grasso's murder was a deep, accumulated resentment among Patriarca family members in both Connecticut and Massachusetts, resentment of his greed, his ruthlessness, and his territorial overreach, conditions that had simply become intolerable to enough of his own organization's members that they were willing to act against their own underboss. It marked, according to crime historians who have studied New England's organized crime history in detail, the opening killing in what would become a 5-year mob war spreading across Massachusetts and Connecticut. The violence did not pause for even a single day. Just 5 hours after Grasso's body was discovered, gunmen shot and seriously wounded Francis Cadillac Frank Salim outside a restaurant in Saugus, Massachusetts, a near-simultaneous attack that made unmistakably clear this was not an isolated grievance, but an organized, coordinated power struggle. Salim, a close associate of Junior Patriarca, who had been released from prison in 1988 and had risen quickly through the family's ranks afterward, survived the attempt on his life and would go on, in the years ahead, to play an even larger role in the family's story within days. An informant inside the organization, a soldier named Angiulo Sonny Mercurio, told corrupt FBI agent John Zip Connolly that a so-called renegade faction, led by East Boston capo Robert Bobby Cosa, his stepbrother and consigliere Joseph J.R. Russo, and a capo named Vincent Vinny the Animal Ferrara, had planned and executed both the killing of Grasso and the attempt on Salim. This renegade faction sought to seize control of the family's lucrative gambling, extortion, and drug-adjacent rackets across the greater Boston area, challenging the legitimacy of Junior Patriarca's leadership and the authority of the men, like Grasso, who had been propping it up. It is worth pausing again on the corrupted nature of federal law enforcement's role in this period, because it recurs with almost eerie consistency throughout this entire history. Much of the legal chaos and informant-driven intelligence surrounding the Patriarca family's late 1980s Civil War ran directly through the relationship between James Whitey, Bulger's Winter Hill Gang, and Agent Connolly, who, in exchange for incriminating information about the Patriarca organization, provided Bulger and his associates with protection from prosecution for their own, frequently far more violent, criminal activities. The FBI's organized crime strategy in Boston during these decades was, time and again, built on a foundation of compromised relationships, informants who were themselves active, dangerous criminals, protected by agents willing to look the other way in pursuit of cases against the Italian-American Mafia specifically. Junior Patriarca, watching his organization tear itself apart from within, found himself in an almost impossible position. According to accounts from this period, he was eventually forced to resign his post under direct threats of assassination, even as he simultaneously attempted, in late 1989, to broker a fragile peace between the warring factions. It was this attempted reconciliation that produced one of the single most consequential pieces of evidence in the entire history of American organized crime prosecution. On October 29, 1989, mobsters from across New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts gathered at a modest residential home at 34 Guild Street in Medford, Massachusetts, for a secret and deeply traditional ritual, the formal induction of 4 new soldiers into the family. The men being inducted that day were Robert Bobby DeLuca, Carmen Tortora, Vincent Federico, and Richard Floramo. The house itself belonged, in a sense, to no one connected with the ceremony directly. It was the home of Vincent Federico's sister, which Federico had, according to court documents, borrowed without her full knowledge. Federico himself had obtained a weekend prison furlough to attend, citing family business on his application, a phrase that, in retrospect, carries a particularly dark double meaning. What none of the 20 or so men gathered in that house knew was that the FBI, posing as utility workers, had run a wire from the house the night before, out to another home further up the same street, using a so-called roving bug warrant obtained from United States District Court Judge David S. Nelson, a warrant that allowed prosecutors to record specified mafia suspects wherever they happened to be, rather than being limited to a single fixed location. Federal agents spent 6 hours capturing every word spoken inside that house. Among those present, at least one man was already a federal informant, Angiulo Sonny Mercurio, the same soldier who had earlier tipped off the FBI regarding the Grasso murder, was present at the ceremony and had, according to court documents and later testimony, also helped tip the Bureau off to the ceremony itself, alongside other informants including Stephen, the rifleman Flemmy, the longtime associate of Whitey Bulger. The ceremony that followed has been described by historians as the first, and to this day, the only recording of its kind ever captured by American law enforcement. Undisputed audio proof, played later in open court, that La Cosa Nostra existed exactly as informants and prosecutors had long claimed it did. Junior Patriarca opened the proceedings with words that, knowing what had come before, sound almost plaintive. We're all here to bring in some new members into our family, and, more than that, to start maybe a new beginning. Put all that's got started behind us, and bygones are bygones, and a good future for all of us. It was, in essence, a public surrender to the renegade faction, dressed up in the language of reconciliation. An acknowledgement, audible on tape for any jury to hear years later, that the killing of his own underboss and the attempted killing of his close associate Salim were now simply to be set aside. The 4 initiates pricked their trigger fingers, allowed blood to mix symbolically with the ceremony's godfathers, and burned pictures of a saint while pledging their loyalty to the organization, a ritual passed down, according to consigliere Joseph J. R. Russo's own remarks captured on the recording, across what he described as 7 generations of Sicilian-rooted tradition, with branches extending to New York, Boston, Providence, Hartford, Chicago, and other American cities. A Sicilian-born capo named Biagio di Giacomo administered the formal oath in Italian, offering the inductees a brief history lesson on the Mafia's origins, and warning them, in stark terms, of what membership truly meant. We get in alive in this organization, and the only way we gonna get out is dead. No matter what. It's no hope, no Jesus, no Madonna. Nobody can help us. If we ever give up this secret to anybody, any kinds of friends of mine, let's say, this thing cannot be exposed. At another point during the ceremony, Russo posed a chilling loyalty test directly to initiate Carmen Tortora. If Russo were to tell Tortora that his own brother was a traitor, an informant who intended to do the organization harm, would Tortora kill him? It is the kind of question that sounds almost theatrical when described after the fact. And yet it was asked in complete earnest inside a private home, by men who fully expected never to be overheard. Junior Patriarca closed the proceedings with a tone closer to fatherly caution than gangland menace, telling the newly inducted men, "You've all done everything you had to do. Stay the way yous are. Don't let it go to your head. It's not to be used to make money. It's not an advantage, a ticket to abuse people. It doesn't make you better than other people. The thing is, you have all of us to protect you. If you don't let it go to your head, and you don't abuse it, you'll have a happy life." It would prove to be tragically poor advice for an organization already in the grip of forces far beyond his control. The recording's evidentiary value turned out to be immense. The FBI was able to match Junior Patriarca's own voice to the tape using an old radio interview he had previously given, allowing prosecutors to definitively establish his presence and his words at the ceremony. On March 26, 1990, Junior Patriarca, Underboss Nicholas Nicky, Bianco, who had stepped in to take over the family's Providence operations following Grasso's murder, and 20 other family members and associates were indicted on a sweeping array of charges, including racketeering, extortion, narcotics trafficking, illegal gambling, and murder. Federal officials at the time described the action as the single most sweeping attack ever launched against one organized crime family in American history. The induction ceremony recording, played in court, became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case, and prosecutors used it repeatedly in this trial and in subsequent ones to bolster the underlying claim that Mafia membership itself constituted ongoing participation in a criminal racketeering enterprise. Because of the embarrassment and legal exposure created by the tape, Junior Patriarca was effectively replaced as boss, with leadership shifting to Bianco, a New York Colombo family transplant who had spent years working alongside Patriarca's organization in Providence and who, by most accounts, maintained a notably lower public profile than either Raymond Cesar or Junior ever had. Bianco's own time at the top, however, would be brief. He was imprisoned on December 28, 1991, following his conviction in the racketeering case, built substantially on the induction tapes, and he died in prison on December 14, 1994, of complications from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. By 1991, Francis Cadillac Frank Salim, the very man who had survived the assassination attempt on the same day Grasso was murdered, had risen to become boss of the Patriarca family in his own right. But rather than ending the internal conflict, Salim's ascension escalated it. Both his loyalists and the renegade Cosa Russo Ferrara faction continued to compete for control of the family's extortion payments and remaining rackets throughout the early 1990s. A key Cosa faction member named Anthony Ciampi owned a club on Bennington Street in East Boston that became the renegade faction's effective headquarters, hosting gambling and illegal card games for its members. Following Carosa's own sentencing to 19 years in prison in April 1992, it took nearly 2 years for his faction to organize its planned retaliation against Salim's leadership. Ciampi and an associate named Michael Big Mike Romano S.R. reportedly visited Cosa multiple times in his Pennsylvania prison to seek his blessing for continuing the war, a detail that speaks volumes about how deeply institutional, how thoroughly procedural, even an internal mafia civil war could become. As one assistant United States attorney involved in prosecuting these cases later put it, you could not credibly take on a made mafia member without having a made member of your own backing your effort. Carosa's blessing supplied that legitimacy. After Salim's top enforcer, Richard Richie the Hatchet Devlin, began attempting to extort tribute from Ciampi and Romano in October 1993, the rebellion finally turned violent again. On March 31, 1994, Ciampi opened fire on Devlin and another Salim enforcer, Richard Richie Nine Lives Gillis, outside the Breeds Hill Social Club. Devlin was killed despite wearing a bulletproof vest. Gillis survived after being shot 3 times. Ciampi was eventually indicted, alongside 14 others, on federal murder and attempted murder charges in April 1997. And in November 1999, he pleaded guilty to killing Devlin, wounding Gillis, and participating in several other attempted murders connected to the long-running feud, receiving an 18-year prison sentence. He was released from prison in 2013. By the time this entire cycle of violence finally burned itself out in the mid-1990s, the Patriarca family had lost something far more valuable than any single member, however senior. It had lost the aura of internal discipline and unquestioned authority that Raymond Sr. had spent 30 years constructing, where his organization had once operated like a single, coordinated institution. It now resembled something closer to two rival armies that happened to share a name, a history, and an increasingly thin claim to the same criminal territory. And waiting just beyond this internal carnage, federal prosecutors, armed now with the induction ceremony tapes, with the testimony of informants like Mercurio, and with decades of accumulated wiretap experience stretching all the way back to the Atwells Avenue office, were preparing the final, most comprehensive legal assault the family would ever face. What does it look like when the full weight of federal law finally catches up with an organization that spent half a century evading it? Slowly at first, and then almost all at once. The legal tool that made the final dismantling of the Patriarca family possible was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known by its acronym RICO, signed into federal law in 1970. RICO had been designed, from the outset, to address precisely the kind of organization the Patriarca family represented, not a single criminal act, prosecutable in isolation, but an ongoing criminal enterprise, structured hierarchically, sustained over years through a pattern of related offenses, including murder, extortion, gambling, and loan sharking. Where earlier generations of prosecutors had been forced to build cases murder by murder, hijacking by hijacking, RICO allowed the government to indict an entire organizational structure as a single continuing conspiracy, to put, in effect, the family itself on trial, rather than merely its individual members. The 1990 indictment of Junior Patriarca, Nicholas Bianco, and 20 others, built substantially on the Medford induction ceremony recording, represented one of the earliest and most consequential applications of this RICO strategy against the New England family specifically, but it was far from the only one. Throughout the early and mid-1990s, federal prosecutors in Boston, Providence, and Hartford worked through a steady sequence of racketeering cases that, piece by piece, dismantled the family's remaining leadership structure. Robert Carosa's own legal saga illustrates how thoroughly this prosecutorial strategy worked. After being sentenced to 19 years in prison in 1992 for his role in the renegade faction's war against Salem's leadership, Carosa found himself, years later, back in federal court facing additional charges connected to the Devlin murder and the broader violence of the 1990s Civil War. On November 1, 1999, Carosa opened his own defense at trial with a notably candid admission, telling the jury he was a little nervous before going on to acknowledge that he had previously confessed, during his 1992 case, to being part of a criminal enterprise. Unlike some witnesses in this case, he told jurors, I accept the fact that I'm guilty of crimes and accept punishment for them. Despite this candor, prosecutors lacked direct evidence tying him to the specific murder conspiracy charges at issue in that particular trial, and roughly a month into proceedings, Carosa's attorney negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for pleading guilty to a felony gambling charge and accepting 2 additional years added to his existing sentence. Carosa was exempted from testifying before any federal grand jury investigating the Patriarca family, or from otherwise cooperating with prosecutors. It was, in its way, a final, quiet act of omerta from a man who had already spent the better part of a decade behind bars, willingness to add to his own sentence rather than ever formally cooperate against the organization he had once tried to seize control of. Francis Cadillac Frank Salem's downfall followed a very different path, and one that illustrates just how thoroughly the old codes of silence had eroded by the 1990s. Salem was jailed in 1995, having served as boss of the family since 1991 amid the chaos of the ongoing Civil War. He would eventually become a government witness himself in 2001, the very boss of the Patriarca family turning informant, an outcome that would have been almost unthinkable in Raymond Patriarca's era. when the entire structure of the organization had been built around an assumption of absolute, lifelong silence. Salem lived into his late 80s. Dying in December 2022, his brother, John Action Jack Salem, served briefly as acting boss during the same turbulent period before he, too, was jailed. Joseph J. R. Russo, the consigliere whose voice had been captured administering loyalty tests at the 1989 induction ceremony, and who had also been one of the two gunmen who killed Joseph Barboza back in 1976, was convicted under RICO and died of natural causes in 1998 while incarcerated in Springfield, Missouri. By the mid-1990s, leadership of the family eventually settled on Luigi Baby Shax Manocchio, who took over in 1996 and, notably, returned the family's center of leadership back to Providence after years during which Boston-based figures had dominated the organization's top ranks. Manocchio's tenure marked a kind of return to the older, more cautious style of leadership that had characterized Raymond Sr. Decades in charge, a deliberate effort, by most accounts, to keep the organization's remaining members out of the kind of catastrophic legal exposure that had defined the 1980s and early 1990s. It worked, after a fashion, for a time, but the organization Manocchio inherited was a shadow of what Raymond Sr. had built. By 2012, researchers and law enforcement officials estimated that the Patriarca family's membership had fallen to approximately 30 made men, a staggering decline from a peak that, at the height of Raymond Sr.'s power, had reportedly exceeded 100 made members across the family's full territory. Manocchio's own legal troubles eventually caught up with him as well. He stepped down amid a federal investigation into allegations that he had been extorting protection payments from strip clubs in Providence, a relatively pedestrian racket, by the standards of the family's earlier history, but one that nonetheless drew exactly the kind of federal scrutiny the organization could least afford by this point. Manocchio lived to 97 years old, dying in Bristol, Rhode Island, on December 8, 2024, one of the very last living links to the family's mid-century peak, and a man whose death, by the time it occurred, drew relatively modest attention compared to the headline-grabbing arrests and trials of his own era decades earlier. It is worth taking stock, at this point in the story, of just how comprehensively the federal government's decades-long campaign against the Patriarca family had succeeded by the dawn of the new millennium. Raymond Sr. was gone. Angiulo had served decades and been paroled into quiet retirement. Tamaleo had died in prison, wrongfully convicted. Grasso had been murdered by his own organization. Bianco had died in prison. Russo had died in prison. Cosa had spent the better part of 2 decades incarcerated. Salem had become exactly the kind of cooperating witness the organization's entire code of silence had been built to prevent. Where Raymond Sr. had once commanded an empire stretching from Worcester to Hartford, governed by an unwritten code so absolute that even congressional investigators struggled for years to crack it, his successors had presided over a collapse driven by the very thing his decades of careful discipline had been designed to prevent: betrayal, informants, and internal violence occurring not at the hands of rival organizations, but at the hands of the family's own members, turning on one another in a war that no single boss, after Raymond Sr., ever proved capable of fully controlling. A former federal prosecutor, reflecting years later on the cumulative effect of this era, offered perhaps the most clear-eyed summary available. There was not, in his assessment, much of anything left of the Patriarca family, because its leadership had been thoroughly destroyed, and no one within the remaining ranks possessed the strength to step into the resulting void. That assessment, delivered with the benefit of hindsight, brings us to the final, quieter chapter of this long history, the story of an organization that did not vanish entirely, but that gradually, undramatically, faded into something closer to memory than menace. What does a mafia family look like once the fear is gone, once the headlines have moved on, once the federal agents assigned to watch it have largely turned their attention elsewhere? In New England, by the early 21st century, the answer had become almost gentle in its diminishment, a slow fade rather than a final collapse, carried forward by a handful of aging men whose names meant little to anyone outside a small circle of law enforcement officials and crime historians. Following Luigi Manocchio's departure from leadership amid the strip club extortion investigation, command of the family passed through a sequence of figures whose tenures, compared to Raymond's 30-year reign, now measured in years rather than decades. Alexander Sonny Boy Rizzo led the organization from roughly 1996 to 2004. Before being imprisoned between 1995 and 1998 on related charges. He died on January 20th, 2005. Leadership then passed to Carmen S., the cheese man D'Annunzio, a Boston faction figure who would, in various capacities, dominate the family's top ranks for the better part of 2 decades. D'Annunzio's own path to the top of the organization began, like so many others in this story, in the North End crews that had once answered to Jerry Angiulo during the 1980s. D'Annunzio and his brother Anthony served as underlings within Angiulo's organization. Their relationship with that structure soured badly in 1983, after D'Annunzio attempted to extort a protege of Angiulo's named Vincent D.D. Gioacchini, an act of overreach serious enough that Angiulo reportedly put a contract out on D'Annunzio's life. The brothers fled, seeking refuge in Las Vegas and Los Angeles, where they worked as bookmakers and debt collectors for the Chicago outfit until it was safe to return to Boston. By the mid-2000s, D'Annunzio had been named Underboss and was considered, according to FBI documents later filed in court, the top Boston-based member of the entire Patriarca organization. He earned his nickname, the Cheeseman, from an unusually mundane and almost charming source. He ran a gourmet cheese shop in Boston called Fresh Cheese, operating his legitimate small business and his underworld responsibilities, by most accounts, in parallel. In December 2006, D'Annunzio was arrested on public corruption charges connected to what became known as the Big Dig bribery case, a scandal tied to Boston's enormous, scandal-plagued Central Artery Highway Tunnel project. He was also separately accused, in later years, of overseeing large-scale bookmaking operations across the Boston area, managing sports betting and enforcing payment through intimidation. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison under a combined plea arrangement and was released in 2015, after which he stepped back into family leadership roles, eventually being widely described in news coverage as the organization's reputed boss by the mid-2010s, though, tellingly, even contemporary sources differed on his exact title, some calling him Underboss, others Godfather, others simply Boss, a small but telling sign of just how blurred and uncertain the organization's formal hierarchy had become by this point in its history. The broader picture of the family during these years, painted consistently by multiple law enforcement officials who spoke to journalists, was one of unmistakable institutional decay. A former superintendent of the Rhode Island State Police, reflecting on the organization's modern condition, stated plainly that while the family still consisted of roughly 30 made members, it was simply not operating at anywhere near the threat level it once represented, and that other criminal entities now posed a far greater danger to public safety than what remained of New England's Mafia. A former Massachusetts State Police detective lieutenant went further, describing the family as little more than a shell of its former self, its membership consisting mostly of figurehead figures and aspiring wannabes rather than the disciplined, business-minded captains and soldiers who had once run gambling and loan sharking, operations worth untold millions of dollars across 5 states. And yet, even in this diminished state, the institutional memory of the organization persisted, carried forward by men whose careers stretched back, in some cases to the Patriarca Sr. era itself. Edward Eddie Lotto served as underboss out of Providence for several years during the family's modern period, before dying of natural causes on August 23, 2024, at the age of 77, after surviving a heart attack and undergoing treatment for cancer. Matthew Good-Looking Matty Guglielmetti, a longtime Cranston-based capo who had been favored by Raymond Patriarca Sr., himself early in his criminal career during the 1970s, and who had been formally inducted in a Boston ceremony in 1977 alongside 7 other men, cycled through various leadership roles during these same years, stepping down from one period of leadership before briefly returning to another. The family's geographic reach, though diminished, did not entirely disappear in Connecticut. The remnants of the crew, once controlled by the murdered underboss, William Grasso, continued to operate under a sequence of leaders, eventually passing to a man named Anthony Ascenzia, who led the Connecticut faction's operations out of New Haven and Branford until his death in 2020, at which point leadership passed to an associate named Eddie Perrette, who, according to organizational reporting, reports directly up the chain to Providence-based leadership figures. It is a small but meaningful detail, proof that even in its weakened state, some thread of the organizational structure Raymond Sr. first built in the 1950s continued, in attenuated form, to function, the most significant and symbolically weighty development of the family's recent history arrived in December of 2024, with the death of Luigi Manocchio at age 97, which we touched on briefly in the previous chapter, and then, less than a year later, with the death of the organization's most recent boss. On September 21, 2025, Carmen the Cheese Man D'Annunzio died at the age of 68. According to reporting at the time, he passed away peacefully, having struggled in his final years with significant health problems, including severe obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart issues. According to his own attorney's public statements, D'Annunzio's death created what multiple outlets, covering the story, described as a broader leadership vacuum within an organization that had already lost much of its power and influence over the preceding 2 decades. It is a striking detail, and one worth sitting with for a moment, that the FBI's Boston field office had, just months before D'Annunzio's death, quietly disbanded its dedicated organized crime squad altogether, reassigning the agents who had once focused specifically on the Patriarca family and its associates to other investigative priorities. The institution that had spent the better part of 70 years through wiretaps on 12th Avenue, informants like Joseph Barboza, the bugged induction ceremony in Medford, and decades of RICO prosecutions, methodically dismantling this organization's leadership, had effectively concluded, by the time of D'Annunzio's death, that the fight was largely over, that whatever remained of the New England Mafia no longer warranted a dedicated unit of its own. In the weeks following D'Annunzio's death, leadership of the family passed to Robert Francis Carrozza, the same East Boston mobster, now in his 80s, who had led the renegade faction's bloody rebellion against Patriarca family leadership back in 1989, and whose long criminal career we traced in some detail in our chapter on the family's civil war. According to reporting from organized crime researchers, Carrozza formally assumed the title of boss in the weeks following D'Annunzio's passing, becoming, as of this telling, the reputed head of an organization that, by most informed accounts, now consists of a few dozen aging members spread across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, a figure operating from East Boston who had once, decades earlier, been part of the very insurgency that helped tear apart the discipline and unity Raymond Sr. had spent his entire career building. It is a strange, almost circular kind of historical justice. If you choose to see it that way, the man who, in 1989, helped ignite the civil war that fatally weakened the Patriarca family's internal cohesion is the same man who, in 2025, inherited what little remains of the organization he once helped to break apart. Joseph Joe Ruggiero Sr., a longtime capo who had operated for years out of Fall River, Massachusetts, and who had served as a close associate and driver for both former bosses Salam and Menocchio, took up the role of underboss beneath Cosa, working alongside Biagio Benny the Greaser, Di Giacomo the same, Sicilian-born capo, whose voice had been captured on the 1989 induction tapes, administering the Mafia oath in Italian to 4 new initiates inside a borrowed house in Medford, decades earlier, in a recording neither he nor anyone else in that room ever imagined the public would someday be able to listen to online. And so, as of this telling, the organization that Raymond Patriarca built on Atwells Avenue in the 1950s that survived Senate hearings, federal wiretaps, the testimony of its own hitman, the wrongful imprisonment and death of its own underboss, a civil war that claimed more than a dozen lives, and decades of relentless RICO prosecution, persists, in some attenuated form, into the present day. It is led by men now well into their 70s and 80s, operating in a world where federal law enforcement has largely moved its attention elsewhere, where Federal Hills pinball machines and vending operations have long since given way to upscale restaurants and tourist foot traffic, and where the very phrase New England Mafia carries, for most people who encounter it now, the flavor of history rather than the texture of present danger. What remains, in other words, is not an empire. It is an inheritance, quieter, smaller, and far less feared than the one Raymond Patriarca first assembled from a wood-framed storefront on a Providence side street more than 70 years ago. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a place once its history has moved past it. And if you walk down Atwells Avenue in Providence today, you can feel exactly that kind of silence. Even amid the noise of restaurants and tourists and traffic, the painted pine cone arch still stands at the entrance to Federal Hill, a landmark now photographed mostly by visitors looking for a good Italian dinner rather than by FBI surveillance teams looking for a glimpse of the city's most powerful man. The building that once housed the National Cigarette Service Company and Coin-O-Matic distributors is gone, or transformed, or simply unremarkable now to anyone who does not already know its history. The street itself remembers nothing. It is only people, and the records people leave behind, who remember anything at all. It is worth asking, as we come to the end of this long story, what exactly the century-long arc of the Patriarca crime family actually tells us, not as a piece of entertainment, not as a collection of dramatic murders and courtroom confrontations, but as a genuine historical phenomenon, one small but illustrative thread in the much larger story of organized crime in 20th century America. The first thing this history makes clear, if you sit with it carefully, is how much the rise of an organization like this one depended on conditions that no longer exist in quite the same form. Prohibition handed an entire generation of immigrant entrepreneurs, legitimate and illegitimate alike, an instant criminal economy worth billions of dollars, built around a product, alcohol, that most ordinary Americans wanted and were willing to break the law to obtain. Without that singular policy failure, it is difficult to imagine the kind of rapid capital accumulation that allowed men like Frank Morelli, Philip Bucola, and eventually Raymond Patriarca to transform scattered neighborhood rackets into a unified, multi-state criminal enterprise capable of bribing governors' aides, intimidating witnesses, and commanding the loyalty of dozens of captains and hundreds of soldiers across 5 states. The second thing this history makes clear is how thoroughly the organization's eventual unraveling was driven not primarily by rival criminal competition, but by 2 forces working, however imperfectly, from within the bounds of American law: federal electronic surveillance, and the systematic cultivation of informants from within the organization's own ranks. The wiretap planted inside the 12th Avenue office in the early 1960s. The bug installed at Jerry Angiulo's headquarters on Prince Street in 1981, and the extraordinary recording captured inside a borrowed house in Medford in October 1989. These 3 pieces of hidden electronic evidence, more than any single act of violence committed against the family by an outside rival, did more than anything else to dismantle the Patriarca organization's leadership across 3 separate generations. Add to that the parade of men willing to testify against their former associates: Joseph Barboza, John Red Kelly, Angiulo Sonny Mercurio, and eventually Francis Solon himself. And you have, in essence, the entire mechanism by which American law enforcement learned, over the course of several painful decades, how to dismantle organizations built on codes of silence that had once seemed unbreakable. But the third thing this history makes clear, and perhaps the most important thing for us to sit with honestly before we close this story, is that the institutions pursuing the Patriarca family were not themselves uncomplicated heroes in this narrative. We have spent considerable time across several chapters walking through the case of Henry Tamaleo, Peter Limone, Louis Greco, and Joseph Salvati, 4 men, one of them Raymond Patriarca's own underboss, convicted of a murder a federal court would later determine, with overwhelming documentary evidence, that they did not commit, because FBI agents knowingly allowed a star informant to lie under oath in order to protect other, more valuable informants from exposure. 2 of those men died in prison before the truth ever reached them in any form that mattered. It would be a disservice to this history, and to the people whose lives were genuinely destroyed by that injustice, to tell this story as a simple, satisfying tale of good government finally triumphing over bad criminals. The real story is messier than that, and more uncomfortable, and in some ways more instructive precisely because of that discomfort. What, then, finally, do we make of the family's slow decline across the final 3 decades of this story? The Civil War of the late 1980s and early 1990s, the RICO prosecutions that followed, and the quiet, almost gentle fade into the diminished organization that exists in some attenuated form, even now? Perhaps the simplest and most honest answer is this: organizations built primarily on fear and unwritten codes of loyalty are only ever as strong as the men enforcing those codes. Generation after generation, Raymond Patriarca Sr. possessed, by every account that survives him, a rare and specific combination of patience, business discipline, political instinct, and personal menace that allowed him to hold an entire 5-state criminal organization together for more than 30 years. Through Senate hearings and prison sentences, and the testimony of his own former hitman, his son inherited the title, but not, it seems clear in retrospect, the particular set of qualities that had made the title meaningful in the first place. And once that internal discipline cracked, once underbosses began dying, at the hands of their own organization, rather than at the hands of the federal government or a rival family, there was no version of RICO prosecution, however effective, that needed to finish the job. The family had already, in the most meaningful sense, begun finishing it themselves, and that brings us to the end of the road for tonight. Thank you for staying with this story for as long as you have, through Federal Hill, through the courtrooms, through the long, slow unraveling of an empire that once seemed unbreakable. If you're still awake, tell me one more time. What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? I always like knowing who made it all the way to the end with me. If this story kept you company tonight, consider leaving it a like, and if you'd like more long, quiet histories like this one to fall asleep to, subscribing helps make sure you don't miss what comes next. There's another story already waiting in this series. Another empire, another rise, another quiet, inevitable fall, and I'd be glad to have you back for it. Until then, sleep well, wherever you are.